I never knew a room could be this quiet and still smell so much like noise. The police station had that kind of silence, the kind that comes after arguments and before decisions, the kind that presses on your chest and waits to see what you'll become. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept them busy with a paper cup of water that tasted like old coins. Beside me, my son traced circles on his jeans with his finger, slow and steady, as if he were drawing a secret only he could see. He was 9, too young to understand the politics of a family name, old enough to understand danger when it wore a familiar face. Across from us, under the humming fluorescent light, my father-in-law sat upright like a verdict. He had the kind of posture that looks like honesty from far away. Up close, it looked like fear, pretending to be authority. He kept his jacket on even though the room was warm, as if he might have to stand and defend himself at any second. But he wasn't the one who'd been asked to explain. I was. Mrs. Hale, a young officer with soft eyes and a clipped pen, approached. "We'll take a preliminary statement soon. There's just," she glanced toward the hall where a door had closed with a heavy sound a few minutes earlier. "There's another report being filed." The word report felt like paper cuts. "Of course," I said. My voice sounded too polite for a woman who'd been accused of something she didn't do. My father-in-law cleared his throat. It was the sound he made before he spoke at church, before he demanded respect at the table, before he decided who got to be guilty and who got to be forgiven. "Officer," he said, "my daughter-in-law is very tired. We've had a difficult season. I'm sure we can resolve this quickly." He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the floor, then the ceiling, everywhere but my son, who squeezed my wrist with the coded language we had invented after his father died. 3 taps for "I'm here." 2 for "Are you okay?" 1 for "I love you." I tapped back. 3. Then 2. Then 1. He nodded, and some of the panic in my chest loosened its teeth. The door down the hall opened. Another officer stepped out. "Older. Careful. The kind of careful that comes from carrying other people's tragedies without letting them break your own back." He looked at the 3 of us, measuring something I couldn't see. Then he said, "We'll start with you, Mrs. Hale." I stood on legs that still felt unfamiliar to me 2 years after widowhood. I still hadn't learned how to stay steady when men in uniforms said my name. My son stood too, but I shook my head. "You can wait here, honey." He hesitated, his eyes flicking to his grandfather. "I'll draw," he whispered, lifting the small sketchbook he kept tucked in his backpack. He never went anywhere without it. Some kids carried action figures. My boy carried pencils. My father-in-law smiled at the officer as if we were all old friends. "I'll keep an eye on him." The officer's gaze paused on the old man's face. Something unreadable moved through a note in the wrong key. "We'll keep the door open," he said to me. "Just a few questions to clarify the complaint." Complaint, another paper cut. Inside the interview room, the table was too shiny, the chairs too light. Everything in these places felt like it could be moved around to suit the story you were trying to tell. The officer sat across from me, placed a recorder on the table, and said my name again like an apology someone else should be making. "Mrs. Hale, can you tell me what happened at your father-in-law's house yesterday afternoon?" I could, but every version I spoke had to pass through the filter of who he was in this town: a donor, a volunteer, a widow's father, a grandfather, and who I was not from here, not invited, not forgiven for loving his son and then surviving him. "I got there at 3, I said. My son was already in the yard. There was yelling inside. Who was yelling? His grandfather. I swallowed. And his uncle. And the allegation, the officer prompted, gentle. He didn't want to say it. He wanted me to say it and see if it fit. "That I took money from the bureau drawer in the study," I said, ashamed at the shape of the sentence. At how easily it slid into the air like it belonged there. I didn't, but he said he saw me. He told me if I didn't return it, he'd call the police. I told him to call. The officer wrote something down, not because he doubted me, but because writing is how you keep things from becoming ghosts. "And you went into the study." "I did," I said, but not when he said. "I went before a Lear, last week, to leave the photographs of my husband in the top drawer for him. He asked for them. He wanted a new frame for the mantel. And yesterday, I stood in the doorway," I said, closing my eyes to remember the geometry of the room. The way light fell on the desk, the sound of my son's voice carrying from the yard like a thread I didn't want to lose. I didn't cross the carpet. I called out for my son. Then I left. He watched me a moment longer than the question required. "Why do you think he accused you?" I could have said grief. I could have said control. I could have said he needed me to be small enough to manage and blame as a very efficient tailor. What I said was, because I stopped asking him for help. A shadow passed the small pane of glass in the door. My son had moved his chair so he could see me. So I could see him, just a corner of him, an elbow, a sleeve, the edge of his face. He was drawing. He always drew what made him feel safe. He used to draw airplanes with his father in the evenings. The two of them bending over the same page, breathing the same invented sky. Now he drew rooms, doors, the places where exits quietly waited for courage. The officer followed my glance. He can sit in, he offered. It's okay, I said. He knows I'm here. He seems observant, the officer said, and there was something in his tone that made me wonder what he had already seen out there. In the holding pattern of the waiting room, the body language, the way my father-in-law's knee bounced when my son looked at him, the way power prefers to sit beneath air vents. Very, I said, he sees details other people miss. Like what? Like which pocket a lie hides in, I said, surprising myself. And the officer smiled against his clipboard. He asked a few more questions. The kind that look harmless until you answer them badly. Times, rooms, who else was home? When we were done, he clicked off the recorder and said, "Thank you. Will you talk to him?" I asked, the word him carrying too much history to fit neatly inside one syllable. "I will," he said, "but first, I want to show you something." He slid a printed photo across the table, grainy, black and white, angled from above. "Doorbell camera," he said, "from the neighbor across the street. They volunteered it a lot faster than people usually do." In the image, the front porch of my father-in-law's house was a stage. The timestamp read to 41 p.m. The figure in the doorway was unmistakable, broad shoulders, a familiar tilt of the head, a jacket buttoned wrong in his hurry. He was carrying an envelope. He was alone. "Is that?" I couldn't finish. "It is," the officer said, "coming in before the time he says you were there." Something loosened inside me, then tightened again. Evidence is a kindness that arrives late and cold. It warms slowly, if at all. The officer didn't smile. He only nodded toward the door. "I think it's time we spoke with your father-in-law, and then if it's all right with you, your son. Only if he wants to," I exhaled. "He'll want to." We stepped back into the hallway. My father-in-law stood too fast, as if standing gave him the moral high ground. "Is it over?" he asked the officer, already trying to claim the narrative. "Not yet," the officer said. "We're going to take your statement now, sir." He turned to my boy, who had stopped drawing and was looking up at the doorway like it could tell him what kind of story this was. "And after, if you're comfortable, we might talk with you too." My father-in-law's lips thinned. He's a child. He didn't see anything. The officer's eyes slid, not to me, but to the sketchbook on my son's lap. Sometimes children see the only thing that matters. My boy looked at me. I gave him the 3 taps. He gave me 2. Then 1. We were a code that had outlived men's certainty. They took my father-in-law down the hall. My son stayed in his chair, clutching the sketchbook. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere, a phone rang and stopped. "What are you drawing?" I asked softly. He angled the page toward me. It was the study, my father-in-law's study. The desk, the window, the rug with its complicated border, the bureau with the top drawer slightly open, and a hand I knew better than my own square fingers, old scar on the knuckle from a fishing hook. A hand that didn't belong to me. I swallowed. "You remember a lot." His brow furrowed. "I don't want them to punish the wrong person," he said simply. "That's not what Dad would want." I closed my eyes against the sound of his name, Dad, the way it still reached for a room. It would never enter again. The door down the hall opened. The careful officer's face was different now, more certain, more tired, more human. He knelt beside my son's chair. "Hey buddy, would you mind talking to me for a minute? Only what you're comfortable sharing." My boy didn't answer. He just looked at his drawing. Then he looked at me. Then he looked past both of us, down the hall, to where the interrogation room sat like a mouth waiting to speak. He stood small, back straight, sketchbook pressed to his chest like a shield. He followed the officer into a different room, not the one his grandfather was in, a room with a glass of water and 2 chairs and a box of tissues that looked like clouds. I sat alone for the first time since the morning my husband died, and the chaplain sat with me but hadn't learned our taps yet. I sat and counted my breaths. I sat and dared to hope that this time, someone would listen before they judged. Through the half-open door, I heard the officer say the words that change the temperature of a room. "Whenever you're ready." A pause, a small inhale, the soft sound of paper being set on a table. Then my son's voice, clear, not loud. The voice of a child who has decided that being small is not the same as being powerless. "You're punishing the wrong person. I saw you do it, Grandpa." The words rose into the hallway and found me like hands. The station went quiet in a new way, not the heavy quiet of waiting, the quiet that comes after a truth lands. And the dust has to choose whether to settle or reveal another line in the floor. I pressed my palms together to keep from breaking apart. For a long beat, no one moved. Then footsteps, the officers. Firm. Another pair, slower, approached the other room. A door opened. A different story had to learn how to breathe. Outside the window, the sky bleached from gray to white. A new day had forced its way into a room that smelled like old noise and gave us, all at once, the quiet of beginning again. The officer came back 20 minutes later with that same stillness on his face. The kind that means someone has stopped guessing and started listening. He asked me to wait in the hallway this time. I could see my son through the window of the smaller interview room, legs swinging from a chair too tall for him. His sketchbook opened like a door to something braver than I'd ever been. Inside the next room, my father-in-law sat at the long metal table. His cane leaned against the wall. His hand rested on the handle like it could still command the world. He was speaking slowly, methodically, each word carved from habit. She came to the house. Around 3. She's been having financial trouble. It isn't the first time I've had to step in. Step in? How? The officer asked, voice neutral. I've helped her since my son passed. She's emotional. She took it out on the family. I don't blame her. Really, grief makes people desperate. The officer didn't write anything down. He let the words pile up like snow, waiting to see which would melt first. So you saw her take the money? Yes, the old man said, with my own eyes. The officer tilted his head. From the bureau? Yes. At what time? He hesitated a second too long. 3:30. The officer turned a page on his clipboard, quietly, deliberately. You said you were home the whole afternoon. Of course. Would you like to see something? He slid the printed still from the doorbell camera across the table. For a second, the old man's jaw locked. His reflection in the glossy paper looked startled, caught mid-motion, hand reaching for his own key. That's you, the officer said gently. My father-in-law forced a smile. Yes, but that must be the timestamp, reads 2:41. The officer said, you told us 3:30. He blinked, trying to reset the story. Maybe the camera was wrong. Those things glitched. The officer didn't argue. Possible, but the neighbor's clock matched the PEC stations. And your daughter-in-law's phone records place her at the pharmacy across town until 3:02. Silence. Then the old man leaned back, lips tightening. Are you calling me a liar? I'm saying your story doesn't fit, the officer said. And your grandson's drawing? What drawing? His voice cracked. The one he made while he waited. He drew your study, the drawer open, your hand in the frame. The color drained from the old man's face. He's a child. He imagines things. Children remember details adults try to forget, the officer said. I couldn't hear more, but I saw it happen. The shift, the way posture betrays what the mouth still denies. My father-in-law straightened his jacket, checked his watch. Like time might rewrite itself if he looked stern enough. Then the officer stepped out into the hallway and nodded at me. He's done for now. You can sit with your son. Inside the small room, my boy was drawing again. The page showed the same study, but now there was light coming in through the curtains, brighter than before. I sat beside him, brushing his hair from his eyes. You did good, I whispered. He looked up. Is Grandpa in trouble? I didn't answer right away. He's explaining things. He frowned. He said he was helping us, but I saw him take it. He thought I didn't because I was behind the door. I saw his hand shaking. I closed my eyes. You don't have to explain anymore. They believe you, but he said you'd go to jail. My throat burned. No, sweetheart, not anymore. He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't soften. I don't like how he looks at you. Neither did I. A detective in a dark jacket came in next. We're running a few checks. Bank withdrawals, fingerprints on the drawer. You'll need to give a statement, ma'am, of course. She lowered her voice. Your son's testimony matches the video. He's sharp. He's too young to need to be, I said. Her face softened. We'll handle the rest. Outside, through the glass, I saw my father-in-law sitting alone now, cane on the table, his head in his hands. For the first time in my life, he looked small enough to fit inside the lies he'd built. The detective returned 10 minutes later. He's asking to speak to you. I hesitated. Is that necessary? It might help close the loop. They put us in a neutral room, no recorder, just gray walls and old coffee. My father-in-law didn't look up when I entered. You think I meant for it to go this far? He said finally. I think you meant for it to go far enough to hurt me, I replied. He sighed. You took my son, then you took his house, his name. I married him, I said, voice steady. You gave him grief. I gave him peace. He slammed his hand on the table. He was all I had left. And you punished me for surviving him, I said quietly. He looked at me then. Really looked, and behind the anger was something like fear. You'll poison the boy against me. You did that yourself. For a moment, we both just breathed the same heavy air. Then the door opened. The detective stepped in. Mr. Hale, we have new evidence. The envelope you deposited at the bank yesterday matches the serial numbers from the missing bills. The old man's hand froze on his cane. That's impossible. It isn't, she said. We'll be taking your statement formally now. He turned toward me, eyes full of something between apology and fury. You think this clears you? You think truth fixes anything? No, I said, but it stops the bleeding. They led him away slowly, and the station felt too bright again. My son came running down the hall, arms open, sketchbook pressed against his chest. Mom, I'm right here, I said, kneeling. He hugged me tight. They said it's okay now. Yes, I whispered into his hair. It's okay now. Behind us, a printer hummed, spitting out the official statement that would change how every dinner, every photo, every memory in that family would sound. But in that moment, all I could hear was my son's heartbeat against mine, steady, brave, the rhythm of truth finally landing somewhere it belonged. The hallway outside the interrogation rooms was colder that morning, like the air itself was holding its breath. Everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and metal, the kind of scent that doesn't fade, no matter how often someone tries to clean what was said there. I sat with my son in the same plastic chairs as yesterday. He was quieter now, not from fear but from something heavier, the knowledge that words can move walls. He hadn't meant to cause damage. Children rarely do. They just open their mouths, and truth walks out barefoot. Through the small glass panel in the door, I could see my father-in-law again. His posture was different today. He sat slightly slouched, his cane resting against the table like an exhausted witness. 2 officers were inside with him, one taking notes, the other leaning forward, elbows on the desk. The way you do when you already know the ending but want to hear how someone tells it. The blinds between our side of the glass and theirs were half closed. From where I sat, I could see half his face, the line of his jaw, the small tremor that passed through his cheek when he tried to hold still. The detective, the one with the dark jacket and tired patience, stepped out of the room, closing the door quietly behind her. She came to us, her eyes softening when she looked at my boy. You've done very well, she said gently. We're almost finished, but we need to ask one more thing. My son's small fingers tightened around his sketchbook. Is he going to jail? We don't know yet, she said. That's for the judge. Right now, we're just trying to understand why he did what he did. He looked down. He said Mom made Dad unhappy. The detective and I exchanged a quick glance. And what do you think? She asked softly. My son's eyes lifted clear, unflinching. I think Grandpa doesn't like when people stop needing him. The detective nodded slowly. That's a very smart thought. When she went back inside, I moved closer to the glass. I could hear faint pieces of conversation, the calm rhythm of a man who was no longer denying, but not yet confessing. I wasn't stealing, he said. That money was mine to begin with. Then why accuse her? The officer asked. Because she took my son from me. Because she changed him. He used to call me every morning. Then she came along, and I became a stranger in my own family. The officer paused his pen. So, you wanted to hurt her. I wanted her to remember who had power, he snapped. You don't understand. This family used to mean something. And then she loved him. The officer interrupted, voice flat. The old man froze. She ruined him. The detective leaned forward. By giving him peace, silence, then the faintest tremor of shame. He left the company. He stopped visiting. He said he wanted to build a smaller life. Smaller. Do you know what that sounded like to me? Freedom, the officer said. My father-in-law let out a sound, not a laugh, not a sigh, something between the two. You think you're clever. You don't know what it's like to have everything you built walk away because a woman told him he was enough. The detective's voice was low, patient. So when he died, you blamed her. I needed to blame someone, he said, and his hand shook hard enough to make the cane rattle against the floor. If I didn't, I would have had to admit I was the one who pushed him away. The words hung there. For a moment, the whole room went still, the kind of silence that carries weight. Not mercy. My son's voice broke the quiet beside me. He's crying, he whispered. I looked through the glass again. My father-in-law's head was bowed. The officer slid a box of tissues toward him, but he didn't take any. His pride wouldn't let him. The detective spoke again. We found something else. Your bank records show the deposit. But the envelope you used, it still had her fingerprints. On the outside, not the inside. His head snapped up. She gave it to me. She didn't, the officer said. You handled it after she left. That's how you transferred the guilt. You wanted it to look like she touched what you'd taken. The old man's face collapsed in slow motion, not from fear of punishment, but from the sudden, horrifying realization that the lie had outgrown him. I didn't mean for the boy to see, he muttered. I thought he was outside. The detective leaned forward. He wasn't. He saw you open the drawer, take the envelope, and hide it under your coat. He saw you frame his mother. And he saw you walk out like nothing happened. The old man pressed both hands to his face. He's just a child, he said again, muffled. No, she said quietly. He's the only adult who told the truth. When they came out, the detective gave me a small nod. He's admitted enough. We'll finalize the statement, but it's over. I nodded, but my throat wouldn't work. My son stood beside me, looking through the glass again. He looks different, he said. How smaller? Yes, I whispered. Truth does that. He leaned his head against my arm. Is it bad that I feel sad for him? No, I said, kneeling to his height. It means you still know how to be kind. He thought about that. Will we still see him? I looked toward the door where they were taking his grandfather's fingerprints. Maybe one day, but not like this. Later, in the main office, the detective let us wait while the paperwork printed. The hum of the copier filled the room. My son sat on my lap, his sketchbook open to a new drawing. This one wasn't the study. It was the station, the window, the table, the chairs. On one side of the glass, the old man sat with his head in his hands. On the other, a small boy stood holding a pencil that glowed like light. Underneath, in his crooked handwriting, he had written, "The truth doesn't shout, it waits." When the detective saw it, she smiled softly. He's right, you know. I kissed the top of his head. He usually is. We walked out into the parking lot together, the late sun bleeding orange over the city. I held his hand. He looked up at me and said, "Mom, when Dad looks down, do you think he knows we told the truth?" I swallowed hard. "Yes," I said. "And I think he's proud of you." He smiled, the kind of small, shy smile that belongs to a child who's seen too much but still believes in light. Behind us, the glass doors closed on the sound of paper shuffling and pen scratching. But ahead of us, the world felt wider, not because we were free, but because the truth had stopped taking up so much space. The days that followed blurred together like ink spilled on wet paper, one bleeding into the next, leaving shapes you could recognize only if you'd been there when they were made. The storm had passed, but its echo lived in everything. The silence of the house, the way my son jumped when the phone rang, the letters that started arriving in plain white envelopes with government stamps. Truth doesn't end things. It only moves them somewhere quieter. The police had called it a confession by omission. My father-in-law hadn't used the word guilty. He'd said things like mistake, pressure, misunderstanding. The officers said it didn't matter. The evidence spoke for itself. The community, however, didn't need evidence. It needed stories. And small towns never run out of ink. The first Sunday after the hearing, I took my son to the park near the courthouse. It was cold, and the sky looked like it was trying to remember what blue felt like. He ran ahead, his laughter echoing between the bare trees. For the first time in months, it didn't sound cautious. When we sat on the bench, I could see the courthouse steps across the street. People were leaving the morning service at St. Andrew's, the church my father-in-law had practically built. His name was still on the plaque out front, carved into bronze, in honor of Thomas Hale for his generous service. It gleamed when the light hit it. Bronze never learns shame. A familiar voice startled me. "He's leaving town, Mara," the detective said, sitting beside me with a paper cup of coffee. I hadn't expected to see her without her badge. They let him go. On bail. Trial in a few weeks, but his health, they don't expect much of one. I stared at the church doors, watching them close. "He'll go back to pretending." Mara shook her head. "No. He's not pretending anymore. He's just old, and afraid." I wanted to believe that fear was enough. That it was justice wearing different clothes. But fear doesn't fix what it breaks. It just hides from the mirror. That night, after I tucked my son into bed, I found his sketchbook open on the kitchen table. A new drawing. This time, it wasn't the study or the station. It was a courtroom, long benches, tall windows, light falling through in slanted lines. In the middle stood his grandfather, head bowed, but around him there were no judges, no lawyers, only empty chairs. At the bottom, he had written, in that same uneven hand, "He's sorry, but I don't know if that helps." I traced the words with my fingertip until they blurred. Sometimes the wisdom of a child hurts more than the crime of an adult. The following week, a letter came. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable, firm and deliberate, even now. It wasn't long, just one page. "I don't ask forgiveness. I know I'd ruin it if you gave it. I only want you to tell the boy I didn't mean to hurt him, that I thought I was protecting what was left of his father. I see now, I was only protecting the part of myself that couldn't stand losing again. There's a key inside. For the study, it's yours now. The house too, if you want it. It should belong to someone who can make it clean again. You were right, Anna. Truth doesn't fix things. But maybe it stops them from rotting further." T.H. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. I folded it and slipped it into the drawer with the rest of the documents, evidence, receipts, custody orders. Proof that the world had once believed lies about me, and that, somehow, I was still standing. 2 days later, the courthouse hearing was held. It was small, procedural, without drama. Just signatures and nods and the slow exhaustion of law. When it ended, I stood outside with my son. The reporters had already moved on to another story. For once, no one wanted a photograph. My son looked up at me, squinting in the pale sunlight. Will we ever see him again? I thought about the letter, the trembling handwriting, the key. I don't know, I said honestly. Sometimes, goodbye is the only thing people have left to give. He nodded, thoughtful, and then said something that broke me in half and put me back together in the same breath. Maybe that's why Dad sent us truth. So we'd know when to stop asking for more. Weeks turned into months. The trial was postponed, then quietly closed. My father-in-law's health declined fast. Heart failure, they said. Guilt has a pulse too, and it beats hard until it breaks something. One gray morning, the phone rang. The hospital. By the time we arrived, it was over. He looked smaller than I remembered. The same hands that once slammed tables and pointed fingers now rested like empty promises. On the bedside table lay a framed photograph of my husband, our wedding day, and beside it, folded neatly, my son's drawing. Not the first one, the last one. The courtroom, with the empty chairs. Someone had written in shaky letters at the bottom, "It does help at the funeral." The air was thick with hypocrisy and regret. People whispered his virtues, his donations, his discipline. No one spoke about the lie. My son held my hand, small and steady. When the priest said, "May he rest in peace," my boy whispered, "Maybe now he can." Afterward, we stood alone by the grave. The detective came, nodded once, and left a white rose on the soil. Then, it was just us, mother and son, the living proof that truth can survive shame. I placed the key from the letter on the ground, beside the rose. "We won't need this anymore," I said. My son looked at me, eyes bright with something too old for his age. "Can we go home now?" "Yes," I said. Home? As we walked away, I realized that the house we were returning to wasn't just walls and windows. It was the space we'd made between all the broken things, the kind of home built from honesty, from wounds that refused to turn into weapons. That night, before sleep, my son left his sketchbook open on his nightstand. One last drawing. The two of us, walking down a road lined with trees. In the distance, the outline of a small house, smoke curling from the chimney. Above it, he'd written, in careful block letters, "We don't need fences anymore." I stood in the doorway, watching him breathe, the soft rhythm of a child who had carried too much and still found a way to dream. And for the first time since the day I buried my husband, I whispered to the dark, not a prayer, not a plea, just gratitude. Because the truth, as painful as it had been, had finally built us something no lie ever could: peace. Years have passed since that night in the police station, yet sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, the shuffle of paperwork, the quiet bravery in my son's voice. Truth, I've learned, doesn't echo loudly, it lingers like a heartbeat you almost forget is yours. My son is 16 now, taller than me, his hair darker, his face sharper. But those same eyes, steady and ancient, still hold the calm of a boy who once told a roomful of adults what they refused to see. He never talks about it anymore, not directly, but every time he sketches something, I can tell which memories he's rebuilding and which ones he's finally letting go. He paints now, not just draws. The sketches have grown into color, into stories that can't be spoken. He says it's because words make truth feel smaller. I think he's right. We moved cities not long after my father-in-law's death. The house, the one he left us, sat empty for a while. Then we sold it quietly. No announcements, no signatures in the newspaper, just an ending folded into the background of life. Sometimes, I still pass by the old neighborhood. The bronze plaque outside the church has been taken down. The wall looks bare without it, but lighter too, like the building can finally breathe. People remember what they want to. Some still speak his name in respect. Others whisper it like a warning. But my son and I, we don't speak it at all. Not out of hate. Out of peace. One Sunday morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, coffee steaming beside his notebook. The window was open, spring air drifting in. He was writing something. "What are you working on?" I asked, leaning over his shoulder. "A college essay," he said with a small grin. "They asked for a story about courage." I froze. "Did you prefer?" "Don't worry," he said, turning the page so I could see. "I didn't use names. I just wrote about that day. About the moment I realized adults lie more out of fear than malice." He paused, looking at me. "And that sometimes the smallest person in the room has to be the loudest one." My throat tightened. "That's beautiful." He smiled faintly. "It's true." That night, after he went to bed, I found the draft still on the table. I told myself I shouldn't read it, that it was his story now, not mine, but the temptation was stronger than guilt. It began simply. The day I told the truth, I thought I was ruining everything. My mom cried, my grandfather yelled, and everyone looked at me like I'd broken something that couldn't be fixed. But later, I realized the truth doesn't break things, it just shows you what was already cracked. And, near the end, I didn't tell the truth to be brave. I told it because I was tired of pretending that love and fear can share the same room. I pressed the paper to my chest and cried, not from sadness, but from the strange relief of realizing that the wound I had feared would define him had instead made him whole. In the years since, he's built a quiet life, music, art, volunteer work. He visits hospitals sometimes, teaching children how to draw feelings they can't say out loud. Once, I watched him kneel beside a girl in a wheelchair, her hands trembling as she tried to hold a pencil. He didn't correct her. He just guided her fingers, whispering, "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be honest." And I thought, that's exactly what he learned that day. That honesty, however small, is a kind of salvation. One evening, years later, we received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was the courtroom, empty, silent. But in the front row, on the wooden bench, lay a folded newspaper clipping and a dried white rose. On the back, someone had written in neat cursive, "Thank you for telling the truth." It saved me. No signature. Maybe it was from someone at the courthouse, or the detective, or perhaps from one of the people who had once doubted us, but it didn't matter. The message had already done its work. When my son turned 18, he asked to visit his grandfather's grave. I hadn't been there in years. The cemetery was quiet, wind moving through the dry grass like soft conversation. He knelt beside the headstone and laid a drawing on the ground. It was simple, a child's sketch, drawn with the same pencil strokes he used when he was little. A house, a tree, two people standing hand in hand under the sun. No words, no tears, no apology, just a picture. He stood up, dusted his hands, and said, "I forgive him." "Why now?" I asked softly. He looked at the sky. "Because I think he finally forgave himself." And I knew then that forgiveness isn't a gift you give someone else. It's the last truth you set free inside yourself. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about all the things that had changed since that day at the police station. The fear, the shame, the slow rebuild of our lives. But more than anything, I thought about how the smallest voice in the room had taught everyone, even me, what courage sounds like. I whispered to the dark, the same way I had years before. "Thank you, my son." And somewhere between the words and the silence, I could almost hear his childlike voice again, saying, "You're punishing the wrong person, Grandpa." Only this time, it didn't sound like an accusation. It sounded like a blessing. Months later, I opened an art gallery downtown, small, humble, but filled with light. The first exhibit featured my son's work. It was called Testimonies of Quiet Places. At the center hung a single sketch, framed in glass. It was the original drawing, the one he made that day, in that cold little room with the blinds half closed. The study, the drawer, the truth. People stood in front of it for minutes at a time, not speaking. Some cried, some smiled, and one woman, an older stranger, whispered, "You can feel the love in it." Yes, I thought, you can. Because even the ugliest truth, when born from love, finds its way toward light. Now, whenever I lock up the gallery at night, I take one last look at that sketch before turning off the lights, not as a reminder of pain but as proof that sometimes, the hardest stories don't destroy us, they refine us, and as the darkness settles, I whisper to the silence, the verdict is peace.